Hello and welcome from the South African capital of Pretoria. This is the intersection of politics and money. My name is Karabole Tlatla. You're watching Political Capital. We have a jam-packed show for you of an African president standing trial in his own courts and a mines minister who is looking for a miracle. All of this amid angry protest from miners on the streets of Pretoria, fighting for jobs. We'll be looking at the big stories of the week, including how former South African President Jacob Zuma will stand trial in his own courts. The newspapers are following the story every step of the way.
The name Tom Moyane dominated the front pages this morning with the story of how he was suspended as the head of the South African Revenue Service. What Ramaphosa told suspended SARS boss Tom Moyane in scathing letter, says Times Live. Developments at the SARS under your leadership have resulted in a deterioration in public confidence in the institution and in public finances being compromised, President Cyril Ramaphosa wrote in the suspension letter to Moyane. Moyane soon bit back, according to News 24. Moyane threatens Ramaphosa with legal action over suspension. In a letter that Moyane wrote to President Cyril Ramaphosa on March the 19th, he said that his suspension was part of an unlawful process. Parliament welcomes Moyane's suspension, but it wants a full inquiry into SARS as soon as possible, so says the Business Day. The Parliament Standing Committee said it understood that tax revenues had declined because of the sluggish economic growth, but also believed the failure to achieve revenue targets was due to the lack of cohesion, unity, efficiency and effectiveness of SARS. And finally, on a very different note, Reuters has the story, World's Last Male Northern White Rhino Dies. The world's last male northern white rhino has died, the Kenyan Conservancy taking care of it said, leaving only 2 females of its subspecies alive in the world, although scientists still hope they can save it from extinction. I wonder if they can do the same for Tom Moyane.
Just over a month ago, the offices behind me were occupied by former South African President Jacob Zuma. Now he and his lawyers are preparing for South Africa's trial of the century. Zuma stands accused of 16 charges of corruption, fraud, money laundering and racketeering. It was a decision by the National Prosecuting Authority that shook the nation.
I think he should face his day in court. And I think it says a lot for South African law, and hopefully it reinstates itself as a law that can govern this country.
I think everyone must be held responsible, because we can't choose and pick who gets punished and who doesn't.
He enjoyed the proceeds of whatever wrongdoing, and then he should face prosecution. But he said that he's waiting for his day in court. So let the courts decide any other way.
You should suffer for your consequences. That's a positive statement, actually.
He must go and face what he did, and he must make it sure that everything that he did is finalized. That would be better that way.
Being a president doesn't mean you are above the law. So I think there's no indemnity for him. He's a normal citizen now. He must face all the charges brought before the court.
I think the nation must leave the old man alone. He's resigned. Isn't that enough for the nation? People got what they wanted. Everyone was crying, Zuma must fall. He has fallen.
I think he needs to have his day in court.
They must leave Zuma because he's down on the seat.
How did we get to President Zuma facing trial? Well, it's been 20 years in the making. Here's some background.
The controversy over the infamous South African arms deal stretches back nearly 20 years. The deal was to buy fighter aircraft, helicopters, submarines and naval corvettes for the armed forces. In November 1998, Cabinet approves the arms deal, which carries a price tag of 30 billion rand. On that day, Jacob Zuma, Shabir Sheikh and arms dealer Thompson CSF meet. September 1999, Patricia de Lille presents Parliament with a dossier compiled by so-called concerned ANC MPs, which contains allegations of extensive corruption in the arms deal. Negotiations and investigations begin. March 2000, Zuma, Sheikh and Alan Tithard of Tint allegedly meet to discuss paying Zuma R500,000 a year in return for protection against a probe into Thompson. June 2003. In the UK, it is revealed that BAE, British Aerospace, had paid commissions to agents to help secure the deal. October 2004, Shabir Sheikh's trial begins. June 2005, Judge Hilary Squires finds Sheikh guilty. He is jailed for 15 years and his lawyers appeal the sentence. Same month, Zuma is charged with having had a generally corrupt relationship with Sheikh. In August, his house is raided by the Scorpions. September 2006, Zuma's corruption case is struck from the roll. September 2008, the High Court rules corruption charges against Zuma are invalid. April 2009, the acting head of prosecution, Mokotedi Moshe, withdraws charges against Zuma. Then, on March the 16th, 2018, nearly a decade later, this happened.
I would thus like to take the opportunity today to inform the nation of my decision in relation to representations I received from former President Zuma on 31 January 2018 in terms of the provisions of Section 179, subsection 2 of the Constitution to reconsider the decision to indict him on 16 charges of an 18-charge indictment.
So what happens next? And what happens when the big day eventually turns out and Zuma has to face trial? I spoke to a legal eagle.
The president has been ducking and diving around the issue of appearing and answering to the charges, despite his purported submission that he wants to have his day in court. It's good also for democracy because we've always reinforced the principle that no one is above the law, including the former president. So it's a victory for democracy, it's a victory for accountability, it's a victory for the state coffers. So it's a very seminal moment.
Do you think Zuma will be in court this year?
I want to think so. I want to think so on the basis of what has happened quite recently. We have seen a shift from the judiciary, evidencing impatience with the former president and his delay tactic. In fact, that was a finding in the North Gauteng High Court. And we've seen that permeate through the Supreme Court of Appeal and to an extent to the Constitutional Court as well. So in my mind, this shouldn't take much longer. And you'll recall that the legal representative of the former president has alluded to the fact that they would want to challenge this. And of course, they have the South African Natives Forum as well, wanting to bring a challenge. I don't think much is to be read into that. I certainly don't think it will be basis, or rather they'll be effective in delaying this any further.
In a democratic sense, this is, as you say, a seminal moment. And to be viewed as a victory for justice. But there's an injustice in the fact that we, you and I, still have to pay for the legal defense of former President Jacob Zuma.
Well, if the law provides for it, then he's entitled to it. It's as simple as that. Then the issue is, should that be the position in law? And we'll recall that there's a whole debate around to what extent can they cover the former president's fees. I don't think it goes without saying that the fees will be covered for the former state president in this particular instance, because you'll recall we're talking about an agreement here which seemingly doesn't have legal basis. And I can tell you in confidence that somewhere someone will make the challenge to the court to challenge this agreement. So it's not a foregone that the fees will be covered, but again, we'll remember the undertaking that was given by the former President Thabo Mbeki in terms of the agreement. If we were to go by what the current president has said, if the former president loses, he's liable to pay back the fees. So I don't really think there's an issue around that one.
What's the limitations of this case? I mean, the arms deal was a huge deal in this country. It was one of the biggest of the democratic era of South Africa. It was billions spent. What's the likelihood that we will have others indicted and probably charged as well?
It's very likely in my mind, because you'll recall the president is not the only person who's facing the charges that are upcoming. He's only the first accused. And should it be that evidence comes out suggesting that other players were involved, for example, Fana Hlongwane, for example. So those are the people that perhaps the state might want to have a look at. So for me now, what we have as the people who are charged at the present circumstance is not a closed list, and I've got all the confidence that more people are going to come out and be charged with the same crime.
President Jacob Zuma faces a corruption case. Well, after all the reviews are done, most likely faces a corruption case. He will also have to, legally be represented in the State of Capture Commission. This balloons the legal bill. I mean, it works well in your favor, but it balloons our legal bill, doesn't it?
No, of course it does. It goes without saying. The state will cover the costs of it. But again, let's not lose sight of the mechanisms that are put in place to recoup these funds. So we still don't know what the specifics are in terms of who's paying for what when. I'd rather sit and wait and hold the current president who gave an undertaking that should the former president lose in all these proceedings, then is liable to pay back the money. So that is what we can hold on for now until we have specifics.
But we're talking about 15 and a bit million rands so far. That's before you take into account all the other court actions that he might incur.
Correct. And then we say 15, but there are talks that it's above that, 45, 60 million even. So again, whatever the figure may be, the bottom line is there are processes that the courts have to go through and a determination has to be made, and then we talk about how do you recoup those funds. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that this is money down the drain, because remember, regardless of who you are and what you're being charged with and what the public perception is, you are still entitled to the protection and the prescripts of the law. If the law says if you're the president acting within the scope of your duties, you're entitled to legal representation that is covered by the state, that must happen. My argument has always been this was outside of the scope of him being the president. These are personal issues. So as a starting point, you should not have been covered. That's my personal view, certainly when it relates to Nkandla. You cannot argue that that was done, or his reaction to the state capture report was qua president, because it related to his personal affairs and that of his house. Similarly with the arms deal, that falls outside the scope. Once you start talking about criminal conduct, you're not talking about someone acting within their scope and within their powers. You're talking about criminal elements necessarily in their personal capacity. So as a starting point, the argument should have been he shouldn't have been covered to begin with. But with that being said, the money can still be recouped.
So could there be more corruption cases as a result of this current case? I spoke to David Lewis of Corruption Watch.
You know, the Zuma strategy, not only over this matter but over everything, has been to avoid, despite his protestations to the contrary, to avoid his day in court as much as he possibly can. And I don't doubt that if there is the opportunity for reviewing Abrams' decision, then he will try and do that. I mean, it seems to me that the difficulty would be that decision wasn't really Abrams' decision. It was a decision that he was instructed to take by the court. And Abrams then gave Zuma the opportunity to introduce sort of additional reasons why he should not be prosecuted. In other words, he could not go over the grounds that the court had already decided, indeed, he must be prosecuted on. So I think, I'm not a lawyer, but I would think the grounds for review would be very, very limited. But I don't doubt that if there is the possibility for review, then they will review it. And, that may portend significant delay, because it will start in the High Court and it could go to an appeal court and it could go to a constitutional court. But I don't know if they have any ground to review this decision at all, given the court's previous involvement in it.
Little-known NGO called South African Native Forum is also appealing for leave of, or rather stay of prosecution when it comes to these charges, claiming political interference. This also adds a layer onto the delay. Now, with that said, I would like us to contemplate who bears the costs of legal representations for Mr. Zuma, considering that he's already taken about 15.5 million of state's money to wage a defense?
Well, I mean, that's already a source of some controversy. I mean, I understood, but maybe imperfectly, President Ramaphosa to say that there'd been some sort of agreement whereby the state would support Zuma's legal costs and that he would then pay back what the state had spent if he lost the case in question, if he was successfully prosecuted. The opposition, one of the opposition parties has threatened to review that decision. I think there's going to be a lot of public opposition and hostility to the notion that the state should continue footing his legal bills. I mean, given what defending him has already cost in a variety of circumstances. So I think it's going to be a controversy. I mean, this business, even if it proceeds smoothly, which it's clearly not going to do, doesn't end here. We're all going to be a lot older before this thing is resolved. There's no doubt about it. But that doesn't, underestimate the importance of the decision, which, as I say, was not really Abrams' decision. It was the decision of the High Court, I think of the Supreme Court of Appeal, the Constitutional Court, in fact, I think some time ago.
Quick question. Are you happy with the degree of accountability that's been put on a company like Thint, for instance, which was not exactly the focus of Sean Abrams' press conference? Surely for every corruptee, there's a corruptor.
Yeah, well, and that's why it's pleasing that Thint is in the dock as well. I think that point is made. I mean, Abrams didn't emphasize it. I mean, in fairness, I suppose the bigger news is the fact that the former president is on trial. But I'm very pleased that Thint are there in the dock next to him, because it does make precisely the point that you're making now, that in fact the arms deal was, attended by corruption from a large number of prominent multinationals from countries that are not particularly themselves tolerant of corruption, but clearly are more tolerant of it being exported by their companies to other countries. And that's what's happened here, and that's why it is pleasing that Thint is in the dock as well.
Stay tuned for the second, where we dig into the issues surrounding the murky and angry world of South African mining. Welcome back to Political Capital, the intersection of money and politics. Now, mining in South Africa has taken a battering over the last couple of years, and the worst is not over yet. New Mines Minister Gwede Mantashe is hoping for a miracle as he tries to sort out the mining charter in 8 weeks, a document that has been in the making for the last 4 years. It's a bloodbath on the streets of the capital city. 20,000 jobs in the platinum sector alone are on the line, and mine workers are angry. This is the biggest union in South Africa's platinum sector, the Association of Mine Workers and Construction Union, marching to save jobs and also demanding inclusion into the contentious Mining Charter 3, the document which guides transformation in the sector.
Briefly, it's about job losses that we are experiencing in the mining industry. Mines are put into a care and maintenance for the sake of super profit by multi-international companies. So we are saying all the mines that are put under care and maintenance for the sake of super profit, let the license be revoked and be given to the workers, jointly to the communities and the black entrepreneurs to run those mines, because we don't want super profit, but for us the mines is for the living.
Now, I understand the new Minister of the Mining Sector, Gwede Mantashe, met some stakeholders over the weekend, but AMCU wasn't a part of that. Were you not invited, or did you choose not to go to that meeting?
We are not invited, but we are not surprised because we are living under democratic capitalism state.
And what is your view as AMCU of Gwede Mantashe, the new minister?
We haven't engaged with him. I believe he was here to receive a memorandum earlier on, but he knows that the workers are coming from four corners of the country. Therefore, the logistics are the challenges. We don't own transport, so he was not patient enough to wait for the workers, but surely is patient enough to wait for capitalists.
Now, other stakeholders in the mining sector, such as the Chamber of Mines, can you give us your relation with the Chamber of Mines and AMCU, and what's your take on them?
I don't care less about Chamber of Mine. Chamber of Mine, they are the pillars of exploitation. They are the symbol of exploitation of the majority of black mine workers. It was a conduit of mineral and energy complex during apartheid times. All this migrant labor system, that was Chamber of Mine that was facilitating such heinous crime against humanity, in particular black mine workers. So therefore, Chamber of Mine must be abolished, must be changed to be a museum.
And then when it comes to the new leadership of South Africa under Cyril Ramaphosa, we understand that they call it the new dawn, but as AMCU and the workers of the mining sector, what is your take on Cyril Ramaphosa?
There is no new dawn. Cyril Ramaphosa will be still driving the same car that was driven by the former President Jacob Zuma. There will be no changes that are progressive, that will benefit the nation. The only thing is going to secure and further the interests of the multi-international company, as they are busy now with the labor bill to take our rights to strike and limit the period of the strike. That is what we call a democratic capitalism. So therefore, we mustn't expect anything. You'll be still operating, driving the same vehicle, sitting in the very same chair that the former president was sitting on.
Now, you've given DMR 7 days to respond to your memorandum. What's the way forward?
The way forward is to wait for them. And if they come up with nonsensical and directionless response, therefore, we are continuing with our campaigns.
The march was intended on maximizing audience and message by taking it to the seat of power at the Union Building, South Africa's administrative center. Meanwhile, just across town in Pretoria, new mining minister Gwede Mantashe has his work cut out. This was the first press conference since taking over the reins 3 weeks ago from Msebenzi-Zwane. Mantashe is hoping to wrap up the much contested agreement, the Mining Charter, in just under 8 weeks.
Now, Chapter 3 is on the table. It is gazetted. The chamber took it to court and we agreed to engage them. The starting point for engagement is not to say there's nothing. It's to say you have a problem with Charter 3. What are those problems? That's why you start. What are the problems? Because Charter 3 to a great extent overlaps with Charter 2. Then let's identify the problems on Charter 3, which is what we did after a candid and a tough engagement with the chamber. They gave us their problem with Charter 3 in writing. That's why now the teams that are working on the details will have something to work on. And our commitment is that anything that is reasonably raised by in those objections will be looked into, if need be, amend Chapter 3.
This is a sector under siege. Capital investments have dried up, and according to the recent Data Button and Associates report, investment levels in 2017 were half of the levels seen in 2008. The average unit output per employee has fallen by 11%, while there have been substantial increase in employee earnings. But Mantashe was not amused by this.
Right is rising costs. You know, one time by prior learning, I learned something called productivity and efficiency. And I was told that it is about your ability to produce more with the same amount, whether it is capital or labor or anything, or produce the same with less. Now, I don't know the rising cost of labor. How to call them? To call wage increase the rising cost, therefore, because the industry is in decline, workers must have their earnings eaten up by inflation, and that is right. I think that approach is dangerous to me. The reason that there is a bargaining process in the industry is because employers and their employees, talk to each other and reach a settlement. When they reach a settlement, they both agree that we can live with it.
But the recent inclusion of mining communities by the South African courts into the negotiations for the Mining Charter 3 has added another layer of complexity, and clearly they cannot be ignored.
We communities and sneaky tuba.
But it's cancelling. It's 2 months now.
Are you 2 months or so? The 26th
No, there's actually 2 months ago. Until we just still the weekend.
Ubalanjani. How 2 months or so? The 26th February.
But okay, it just still in the weekend. The 13th, 30 line, and the 10th. So it's a bit in May. Because next month is April. Next week is April after Good Friday.
It's 5 days. Today
is the 20th.
Yes, of March.
Yes.
It's not even month 1 over.
But it's actually a mukatata.
Yeah, Mama. Sizawuniyela.
Despite the damp weather, anger is still hot from those who work the mine. This is unlikely to go away before the national elections in 2019, where mining is likely to be a big issue. Well, thank you very much for being with us on this episode of Political Capital. Catch us again this Thursday at 6:30 Central African Time, only on CNBC Africa.